The greatest betrayal wasn't another woman. It was discovering that the two people you trusted most had betrayed the memory of the man who died protecting them. General Cedric Hawke's funeral drew the entire kingdom to the Moon Palace. Rain fell steadily across rows of black banners. Thousands of soldiers stood in perfect silence as the hero's coffin was carried through the palace gates. Cedric had been more than the Alpha King's greatest general. He had been Leon Blackwood's closest friend since childhood, the man who had thrown himself between the king and an assassin's blade without a moment's hesitation. His last words had been spoken with blood on his lips. "Protect them," Leon had promised. "I swear it." Standing beside him, Queen Vivian Everhart silently slipped her hand into his. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Together, they watched the kingdom bury one of its finest men. Just behind them stood Cedric's widow, Lady Helena Ashcroft. She looked as though grief itself had become human. Her black mourning dress hung loosely from her shoulders. Her young son clung to her trembling hand. Her daughter buried her face against her mother's side. Vivian's heart broke. After the ceremony ended, she crossed the courtyard without hesitation. She wrapped Helena in a gentle embrace. "You won't face this alone." Helena burst into tears. "I don't know how to live without him." Vivian held her tighter. "You don't have to figure it out today." She knelt before Cedric's children. "Your father was one of the bravest men I've ever known, and this kingdom will never forget him." She meant every word. Within days, Vivian arranged a beautiful home for Helena near the palace gardens. She personally ensured Cedric's children received the finest tutors. Every week she visited with books, meals, and fresh flowers. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes Helena simply cried, while Vivian sat quietly beside her. No advice, no speeches, only company. One afternoon, Helena whispered, "I don't know why you're so kind to me." Vivian smiled warmly. "Because your husband died protecting mine. I promised Cedric I'd look after his family. And I always keep my promises." Leon made the same promise. Whenever royal duties allowed, he visited Helena's home. Sometimes he repaired broken furniture Cedric had never finished. Sometimes he played chess with Cedric's young son. Sometimes he simply sat in silence, remembering the friend he still expected to see walking through the palace doors. Months passed. The kingdom slowly healed, but grief did not. It settled quietly inside both Leon and Helena, invisible, patient. One autumn evening, a violent storm swept across the capital. Lightning shook the palace windows. Flooded roads made returning impossible after Leon delivered supplies to Helena's estate. "You'll have to stay until morning," Helena said softly. "The roads aren't safe." Leon nodded. Neither thought twice about it. After all, she had become family. Later that night, they spoke for hours about Cedric, about the war, about guilt, about all the things neither of them could say to anyone else. Helena finally whispered, "I still wake up reaching for him." Leon lowered his eyes. "So do I." Not because he reached for Cedric, but because every morning he expected his oldest friend to still exist somewhere in the world. Grief erased judgment. Loneliness blurred every boundary that should have remained untouched. One moment, their hands met. The next, they crossed a line that neither had ever imagined crossing. The silence afterward was unbearable. Helena pulled away first. Horror flooded her face. "What have we done?" Leon stared at the floor. His voice barely existed. "We betrayed him." "No." Fresh tears spilled down Helena's cheeks. "We betrayed her." They sat in silence until dawn. When the storm finally ended, so did any illusion that the night could be undone. Leon stood at the door. "This can never happen again." Helena nodded immediately. "It won't. We'll never speak of it." She closed her eyes. "I hate myself." "So do I." Neither realized that the decision they made in that moment, to bury the truth instead of facing it, would destroy far more lives than one terrible mistake ever could. 3 weeks passed. The storm became a memory. The secret did not. Leon buried himself in royal duties. Helena buried herself in guilt. Vivian noticed the change immediately. Leon smiled less. Helena stopped visiting the palace. Whenever Vivian invited her to tea, Helena politely declined. "I've been feeling tired. Perhaps another day." Vivian never questioned it. Grief changed people in different ways. She believed Helena simply needed time. One quiet morning, Vivian prepared a basket of fresh white lilies. Cedric had loved lilies. Every month since his funeral, she placed new flowers beneath his memorial, inside the royal chapel. It had become a promise she kept faithfully. As she walked through the chapel gardens, sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in brilliant colors. The chapel was empty, or so she thought. As she approached the memorial chamber, she heard voices. One belonged to Helena, the other to Leon. Vivian smiled faintly. They were probably discussing Cedric's memorial fund. She slowed her steps, not wishing to interrupt. Then Helena spoke. Her voice trembled. "We have to tell her." Vivian froze. Inside the prayer room, silence lingered for several long seconds. Finally, Leon answered. "If we do, I'll lose my wife." The basket slipped from Vivian's hands. Lilies scattered across the marble floor. The clay vase shattered. The sound echoed through the chapel like thunder. Inside the prayer room, both voices stopped. Footsteps rushed toward the doorway. Leon appeared first, his face drained of all color. "Vivienne," she looked at him, really looked at him. The guilt in his eyes told her everything before he ever spoke. Helena stepped into the doorway behind him. Her face was streaked with tears. She couldn't even lift her eyes. Vivian's heart pounded so violently she thought it might stop. One question escaped her lips, barely louder than a whisper. Was it true? Leon opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His silence lasted only a few seconds, but those few seconds were enough. Slowly, he lowered his head. It was the smallest movement imaginable, yet it shattered 6 years of marriage. Vivian closed her eyes. A single tear escaped. "I trusted you with my heart." Her voice remained calm, painfully calm. Then she looked at Helena, the woman she had embraced. Protected, loved like a sister. "I trusted you with my family." Helena collapsed to her knees. "I'm so sorry. It happened once. I swear. I wanted to tell you." Vivian simply stared at her. One night, one mistake, one confession. None of it mattered anymore, because the betrayal had already happened. And worse, they had chosen silence afterward. Leon stepped forward. "Please, let me explain." She looked back at him. "Explain what? The loneliness? The grief? The storm?" She shook her head gently. "No explanation changes a choice." His shoulders slumped. Tears filled his eyes. "I never stopped loving you." She believed him. That was the cruelest part. She knew he loved her. She also knew he had still betrayed her. Vivian bent down slowly. She gathered the crushed lilies one by one. Their white petals had been stained by the water spilled across the floor. When she finally stood, she placed the broken flowers at Cedric's memorial, then whispered softly, "I'm sorry." Neither Leon nor Helena knew whether she was speaking to the fallen general or to herself. Without another word, she walked past them. Neither tried to stop her. Some instinct told them that if they reached for her now, she would only disappear faster. They listened to her footsteps fade through the chapel. Each one sounded like another piece of their old life slipping away. Outside, the palace bells began ringing the noon hour. Inside, Leon remained standing before Cedric's memorial. For the first time since his friend's death, he understood something far worse than grief. He had survived the war, only to become the man Cedric would never have recognized. Vivian never confronted Leon again. She never demanded explanations, never asked questions whose answers could only deepen the wound. By the time she returned to the palace, her decision had already been made. She entered the royal wing quietly. The servants bowed, as they always did. None of them noticed anything unusual. Only her personal maid, Clara, looked closely enough to see it. "My queen, you've been crying," Vivian smiled gently. "Only for a little while." Clara stepped forward. "Should I prepare tea?" "No. Perhaps your majesty should rest." "I will." It wasn't a lie. She intended to rest. Just not in the palace. Her chambers were exactly as she had left them that morning. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows. Fresh roses stood beside the fireplace. Leon had picked them himself only 2 days earlier. She looked at them for a long moment, then quietly carried the vase onto the balcony. The flowers deserved sunlight, even if their marriage no longer did. She opened her wardrobe. Dozens of royal gowns shimmered beneath embroidered covers. She touched none of them. Instead, she removed a simple blue traveling dress from the very back, the one she had worn before becoming queen. Next came a worn leather satchel. Inside, she packed only what belonged to Vivian, not to the throne. Her mother's silver locket, a small journal, 3 changes of ordinary clothes, a pair of sturdy boots, nothing more. The jewels remained locked away. The ceremonial robes stayed hanging inside the wardrobe. Finally, she lifted the Luna crown from its velvet cushion. She held it in both hands. For years, she had believed it represented responsibility. Now, it felt strangely heavy. She placed it carefully back where it belonged. "It was never the crown that made me worthy," she whispered. "It was the woman wearing it." That evening, Leon returned to their chambers. "Vivian?" No answer. He searched every room, the sitting room, the music room, the library. Nothing. He hurried toward the bedroom, then stopped. Their wedding portrait rested upon the dressing table. Something looked different. He stepped closer. The glass wasn't broken. The frame wasn't damaged. But Vivian's image was gone. She had carefully removed her own photograph from inside the portrait. Only Leon remained smiling back from the wedding day. Behind the frame rested a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he opened it. There were only 2 sentences. "The throne never needed me, but I deserved a husband who remembered why he wore the crown." Leon sank slowly into the chair beside the window. His chest tightened until breathing became painful. No accusations, no insults, no demands, only truth. And somehow, that hurt more than anger ever could. Before dawn, Vivian walked through the eastern palace gate. No guards stopped her. The captain of the guard simply lowered his head as she passed. He had served beside her during the famine years. He could not bring himself to ask where she was going. Only one person followed her to the gates: the elderly palace steward. Elias had served 3 generations of the royal family. He had watched Vivian grow from a shy young noblewoman into the queen who quietly transformed the kingdom. He carried a small travel cloak over one arm. "The mornings are still cold." Vivian accepted it with grateful eyes. "Thank you." He hesitated. "Will you return?" She looked back once toward the palace. The sunrise painted its towers gold. It was beautiful. It no longer felt like home. "I don't know," she smiled gently. "But wherever I go, I'll keep helping people." Elias nodded. "I never doubted that." She mounted her horse, then disappeared into the morning mist. The old steward remained standing, long after she vanished from sight. Finally, he whispered to the empty road, "There goes the heart of this kingdom." Behind him, the palace stood exactly as it always had, magnificent, powerful, untouched. No one inside yet understood that while their queen had left carrying only one small satchel, she had taken with her the quiet wisdom, steady compassion, and unwavering integrity that had held the entire kingdom together for years. The throne was still occupied, but the heart of the kingdom had just ridden away. At first, the kingdom barely noticed Vivienne was gone. Royal ceremonies continued. Council meetings filled the palace each morning. Trade caravans crossed the borders. The markets remained busy. Life appeared unchanged. Leon convinced himself the same thing. She needed time. She would return when the pain had settled. She had always been the stronger one. She would find a way to forgive him. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. She never came back. The first problem seemed small. A charitable bakery that provided free bread to war widows closed without warning. The royal treasurer frowned. It was funded privately. By whom? The answer surprised everyone. Her Majesty? Leon looked up from the report. I didn't know. The treasurer hesitated. There were many things Her Majesty preferred to manage quietly. Soon another report arrived. The orphanage outside the eastern gate had dismissed half its staff. The Queen had personally paid their salaries. Then came another. A peace negotiation with the River Pack collapsed. The ambassador admitted privately. They trusted Queen Vivienne. She always kept her word. Then another. Veterans' pensions stopped reaching remote villages. A clerk quietly confessed. The Queen reviewed every payment herself. The reports continued arriving, day after day, each revealing another part of the kingdom she had quietly carried without seeking recognition. One evening, the royal chancellor entered Leon's study, carrying a stack of weathered ledgers. He placed them carefully upon the desk. What are these? 20 years of royal records. Leon frowned. I've already read them. No. The chancellor shook his head. You've read the official ones. He opened the first ledger. Every page carried Vivienne's neat handwriting. Suggestions, corrections, budget plans, relief programs, trade agreements, education reforms, military supply routes. Every successful policy Leon proudly believed had been the achievement of his reign, had begun with her careful notes. The chancellor smiled sadly. Your Majesty, the Queen never stood behind your throne. He looked around the silent study. She quietly held it together. Leon stared at the pages until the words blurred. He remembered all the evenings she had sat beside him, offering ideas, asking questions, suggesting another perspective. He had accepted them so naturally, he had forgotten where they came from. He had mistaken her unwavering support for something that would always remain. Meanwhile, Lady Helena Ashcroft could no longer bear the weight of her own conscience. She requested an emergency meeting before the Royal Council. The chamber filled quickly. Many expected political news. Instead, Helena walked to the center of the room, dressed in plain black clothing. No jewels, no noble ornaments, only grief. She bowed deeply. What happened between His Majesty and me was never love. The room fell silent. It was loneliness. It was weakness. And it was wrong. Tears filled her eyes. General Cedric deserved better. Queen Vivienne deserved better. So did the kingdom. She removed the signet ring marking her noble title, placed it upon the council table. I renounce my estate, my lands, my title. Everything will be sold. The money shall provide homes for fallen soldiers' families. She drew a shaky breath. As for me, I'll spend the rest of my life serving widows and orphaned children. No one tried to stop her. She quietly walked away from the only life she had ever known. That evening, Leon stood alone inside Cedric's memorial chapel. The silence felt heavier than ever before. He had lost his best friend, then betrayed his memory, then lost his wife. And now, another broken soul had disappeared, carrying guilt that would likely never leave her. He finally understood. No one had escaped that one terrible night unchanged. Far beyond the western sea, a lonely ship sailed toward a distant coastline. Standing at its bow, Vivian looked toward a new horizon. She carried no crown, no title, only a quiet determination. If she could no longer save her own marriage, perhaps she could still spend the rest of her life saving someone else's future. The western coast welcomed strangers without asking who they used to be. It cared only about who they chose to become. When Vivian stepped off the merchant ship, no one recognized a former queen. They saw only a quiet woman carrying one weathered satchel, and a heart that had learned how heavy grief could become. The harbor city of Whitehaven had survived decades of war. Its streets were filled with widows, children whose parents had never returned from battle, old veterans carrying wounds no healer could see. Vivienne walked among them in silence. Every face reminded her of Cedric, of Helena, of Leon, of promises that had been broken. One rainy afternoon, she found a young boy sleeping beneath the steps of an abandoned warehouse. His clothes were soaked, his shoes were torn. He couldn't have been older than 8. She gently knelt beside him. "When did you last eat?" The boy blinked uncertainly. "I don't remember." She offered him the loaf of bread she had bought for herself. He hesitated. "Aren't you hungry?" She smiled. "I'll find something else." He accepted it with trembling hands. Before taking a bite, he whispered, "My father died in the war." Vivienne felt tears sting her eyes. "So did someone very dear to me." The boy looked up. "Does it ever stop hurting?" She thought carefully before answering. "No. But someday, the pain won't be the only thing you remember." That conversation changed everything. Vivian rented a small abandoned house near the harbor. It had a leaking roof, cracked walls, and barely enough room for 6 beds. She repaired it herself. Soon, the little house welcomed its first residents. A widow with 3 children, an elderly veteran who had nowhere else to go, the little boy from the warehouse. Others followed. Word spread quietly. "If you've lost someone, go to the house by the sea. The woman there never turns anyone away." Within 3 years, the tiny shelter became something far greater. Donations arrived from merchants. Doctors volunteered their services. Teachers offered free lessons. Blacksmiths repaired broken tools. Farmers shared their harvests. People who had once received kindness returned to offer it to someone else. The House of the Fallen was born. Its purpose was simple. No family would be forgotten simply because war had ended. Widows received homes. Children received education. Veterans received medical care and honest work. No one was asked which kingdom they had served. Loss recognized no borders. Neither would compassion. Years passed. The house expanded into neighboring provinces. Travelers carried stories of its remarkable founder. Some called her the Lady of Whitehaven. Others preferred another name, the Queen Without a Throne. Not because she ruled anyone, but because she inspired loyalty without needing a crown. When asked why she never accepted political office, Vivienne always answered the same way. "I've already learned that true leadership doesn't depend on where you sit. It depends on who feels safer, because you stood beside them." One crisp autumn morning, a messenger arrived carrying disturbing news. War had returned to the eastern continent. Entire villages had been destroyed. Thousands of families had fled their homes. The Alpha Kingdom struggled to care for the growing number of refugees. The House of the Fallen immediately prepared wagons filled with blankets, medicine, and food. Volunteers worked through the night. As dawn approached, one of the younger workers hurried toward Vivienne. "There's another ship entering the harbor." She looked up. The vessel flew the royal banner of the Alpha Kingdom. Her heart skipped once, only once, then grew calm again. She had spent 7 years building a life that no longer depended on the past. When the gangplank lowered, a single man stepped onto the dock. No royal escort, no soldiers, no jeweled cloak. Just a weary king carrying the weight of 7 years of regret. Leon Blackwood had crossed an ocean. not to reclaim his queen, but to ask for her help. Leon stood quietly at the end of the dock. For a moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake, not because he feared rejection, because the woman walking toward him no longer looked like someone who needed anything from him. Vivian wore a simple gray dress with a linen apron tied around her waist. A few strands of hair had escaped the braid hanging over her shoulder. Her hands carried faint scars from years of work. She looked nothing like the queen who had once walked through palace halls. She looked stronger, more peaceful, more complete. She stopped a few steps away. Neither reached for the other. Neither knew if they had the right. Finally, Leon spoke. "Hello, Vivian." She smiled politely. "Hello, Leon." No anger, no bitterness. Only the quiet courtesy offered to someone who had once been deeply loved. He lowered his eyes. "I heard about the House of the Fallen. It's doing good work." She looked back toward the harbor, where volunteers unloaded crates of medicine. "They're the ones doing the work. I simply started it." Leon watched children laughing as they carried blankets into the shelter. Widows prepared meals together over large iron pots. Retired soldiers repaired broken wagons beside young apprentices. There was no fear, no despair, only people helping one another survive. "You built all of this?" "We built it," she gently corrected him. "No one heals alone." The words lingered in his mind. No one heals alone. How different things might have been if he had remembered that years ago. A volunteer hurried over. "Lady Vivienne, the northern warehouse is running out of medicine." "I'll be there in a moment." She nodded before turning back to Leon. "What brings you here?" He reached into his coat and unfolded a weathered map. Several villages were marked in red. "The Eastern War has displaced nearly 20,000 families. Our shelters are overflowing. Our physicians can't keep up." He met her eyes. "I've come to ask for your help." There was no demand in his voice, no royal authority, only humility. Vivian studied the map for less than a minute. Then she called toward the courtyard. "Thomas!" A gray-haired volunteer looked up. "Yes?" "Prepare every available wagon. Load the medical supplies. Tell the physicians we leave at sunrise." Thomas blinked. "For the Alpha Kingdom? Yes." He smiled. "I'll gather everyone." Within minutes, the shelter came alive. Volunteers hurried between buildings. Carpenters reinforced wagons. Children carefully packed dried herbs into cloth sacks. No one complained. No one questioned the destination. Leon watched in stunned silence. "You didn't even ask what happened." She looked at him calmly. "The innocent are suffering. That's enough. You don't hate us?" She smiled sadly. "Hate is expensive. I found better ways to spend my life." Her answer humbled him more than any accusation ever could. Later that evening, they walked through the shelter gardens together. The setting sun painted the sea gold. Children chased one another between rows of vegetables. An elderly veteran quietly played a violin beneath an old oak tree. Leon finally spoke the words he had carried across the ocean. "I've spent 7 years trying to become someone worthy of the promises I broke." Vivian listened without interrupting. "I've built homes for soldiers' families, created pensions for every widow. No child of a fallen warrior goes hungry anymore." He smiled faintly. "I kept asking myself what you would have done." She looked at him with gentle surprise. "You already knew." He nodded. "I just didn't appreciate it until you were gone." Silence settled comfortably between them. Not the silence of avoidance, the silence of two people who no longer needed to defend themselves. As the last light faded from the sky, Leon realized something profound. For 7 years he had believed loyalty meant never leaving someone's side. Standing beside Vivian now, he finally understood. Real loyalty begins long before temptation. It lives in the quiet choices people make, especially when no one else is watching. And he had learned that lesson far too late. The refugee camps slowly emptied. Families returned to rebuilt villages. Children laughed where fear had once lived. For 3 months, Leon worked beside the volunteers of the House of the Fallen. No one called him Your Majesty. They simply called him Leon. He carried lumber, cooked meals, loaded medicine onto wagons, buried the dead with the same dignity he once reserved only for generals. No one treated him differently, and for the first time in many years, he was grateful for that. One quiet evening, after the final supply wagon departed, Vivian found him repairing a wooden fence behind the shelter. "You've become good at this," he smiled. "I've had excellent teachers." She leaned against the fence. "The volunteers will miss you. I'll miss them." A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that exists only between people who no longer need to pretend. Finally, Leon spoke. "I've wanted to ask you something." Vivian already knew the question. She nodded gently. "Go ahead." He set the hammer aside. "If I could undo that night, if I could go back and make a different choice." He looked directly into her eyes. "Would you come home with me?" For a long time, she said nothing. The breeze carried the scent of the sea through the garden. Children's laughter echoed from the courtyard. Somewhere nearby, a widow sang softly while preparing supper. Vivienne smiled, a smile filled with affection and sadness. "I believe you've become the man I once prayed you'd be." Hope flickered across his face. She saw it. She hated what she had to say next, but the single word was almost a whisper. "I had to lose everything to become the woman I was meant to be." His shoulders lowered slowly, not in defeat, in understanding. She walked a few steps toward the shelter. Rows of modest buildings stretched across the hillside. Women planted flowers outside their new homes. Children chased one another between fruit trees. Old soldiers taught young boys how to carve wooden toys instead of weapons. "This place exists because I left." She turned back toward him. "If I had stayed, I would have spent my life trying to repair our marriage. I never would have built this." Leon looked around him. Hundreds of lives had been changed because one broken-hearted queen refused to let grief define her. "You saved more people here than any throne could have allowed." She smiled softly. "I think so too." He took a slow breath. "So this is goodbye." She shook her head. "No, it's acceptance. I forgave you years ago." "You did?" "I had to. Otherwise, your mistake would have continued ruling my life." A tear escaped his eye. "I'm grateful." She stepped closer, then gently took his hand, not as a wife, not as a queen, simply as someone who once loved him deeply. "I'll always hope you find peace." He smiled through tears. "I already have." She looked surprised. "You showed me what peace actually looks like." He glanced toward the House of the Fallen. "I spent years believing redemption meant getting you back." He laughed quietly at himself. "I was wrong. It meant becoming someone worthy of the woman I lost." Vivian squeezed his hand once, then let go. "I think Cedric would be proud of the man you've become." Those words struck him harder than any punishment ever could, because they were the forgiveness he had never expected to receive. He slowly lifted her hand, pressed one respectful kiss against her knuckles, not as his queen, not as the woman he hoped to reclaim, but as the greatest woman he had ever known. When he boarded his ship the following morning, he never asked her to come with him again. He understood now. Some love stories end with two people growing old together. Others end with two people making each other better, even if they must walk different roads. And sometimes, that ending requires the greatest love of all, the courage to let someone remain exactly where they have finally found themselves. Leon returned to the Alpha Kingdom with empty hands. He did not bring his queen home. He did not expect to. What he carried back was something far more valuable: perspective. The journey across the Western Sea had changed him. Not because Vivienne had forgiven him, because she had shown him that love without integrity is only another form of possession. He never tried to replace her. The throne beside his remained empty. Many noble families encouraged him to remarry. You need an heir. The kingdom needs another queen. Leon answered every proposal the same way. The kingdom needs justice. It does not need another woman asked to live in someone else's place. The discussions ended there. The first reforms he announced surprised the royal council. Every soldier who died defending the kingdom would now leave behind more than a medal. Their families would receive lifelong financial support. Widows would receive homes. Children would receive education funded directly by the crown. Veterans permanently injured in service would never again face poverty. A minister raised his hand. Your Majesty, this will cost the treasury millions. Leon nodded. So did the war. No one questioned that expense. The chamber fell silent. The reforms passed unanimously. Soon people across the kingdom began calling them the Cedric Decrees. Not because they honored one general, but because they honored every family that had ever sacrificed someone they loved. Far beyond the Western Sea, the House of the Fallen continued to grow. What had begun as one weathered building beside the harbor became a network of shelters stretching across several nations. Its schools trained teachers. Its workshops trained veterans in new trades. Its clinics welcomed anyone regardless of nationality or rank. Visitors often asked Vivienne why the house accepted refugees from kingdoms that had once been enemies. She always smiled gently. Grief speaks every language. So should compassion. One spring morning, a familiar face arrived quietly at the house. Lady Helena Ashcroft. She looked older. Her hands were rough from years of work inside the monastery. She wore the simple gray robes of a servant, nothing more. Vivienne recognized her immediately. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Finally, Helena bowed deeply. I don't deserve to stand before you. Vivienne stepped forward. You've been serving widows and orphaned children for 7 years. Helena lowered her eyes. It doesn't erase what I did. No, Vivienne answered honestly. It doesn't. Silence lingered. Then Vivienne gently continued. But it tells me what kind of woman you chose to become afterward. Tears filled Helena's eyes. I think about Cedric every day. So do I. And Leon? Vivienne smiled sadly. I hope he has forgiven himself. Helena nodded. I think he's trying. The two women spent the afternoon preparing meals together, not because the past had disappeared, but because both understood that carrying guilt forever helps no one. Serving others did. Before leaving, Helena quietly whispered, Thank you. Vivienne embraced her warmly. Keep taking care of the families Cedric would have loved. I will. Years passed. The House of the Fallen and the Alpha Kingdom often worked together during disasters. Supplies crossed the sea. Doctors exchanged knowledge. Teachers trained together. Neither Leon nor Vivienne ever allowed personal history to interfere with helping those in need. People sometimes asked whether they regretted living separate lives. Neither answered with sadness. Leon would simply look toward the memorial gardens built for fallen soldiers. Vivienne would look toward the children, laughing inside the house. Both understood the same truth. Their greatest shared legacy was no longer their marriage. It was the countless lives saved because both had chosen service over self-pity. They had rebuilt the world, just not the relationship they once shared. And somehow, that became enough. 40 years later, few people remembered the scandal. History had a way of allowing gossip to fade. Character endured. Children studying the Alpha Kingdom no longer learned first about a broken marriage. They learned about the Cedric Decrees, about the House of the Fallen, about two leaders whose greatest achievements were born from their deepest regrets. King Leon had grown old. His once powerful shoulders had stooped with age. Silver hair framed a face marked by time, responsibility, and quiet humility. Every year, On the anniversary of General Cedric Hawke's sacrifice, he crossed the Western Sea alone. No royal escort, no ceremony, no fanfare. Only one elderly king carrying fresh white lilies. He always stopped first at Cedric's memorial, inside the House of the Fallen. There he would bow his head and quietly say, "My friend, I kept my promise at last. Not perfectly, not immediately, but faithfully." Afterward, he would walk through the shelter's gardens. Children ran freely between fruit trees. Veterans taught young apprentices their trades. Widows laughed together while tending flower beds. No one looked like they had been forgotten. That had always been Vivian's dream. She met him beneath an old oak tree every year. Neither of them dressed like royalty anymore. She wore the simple linen clothing of a woman who preferred work over ceremony. He wore an ordinary traveling coat. Time had removed every unnecessary title between them. "You're late," she teased gently. He smiled. The sea was stubborn. It usually is. They sat together on the same wooden bench they had shared for decades, not as husband and wife, not as lovers trying to reclaim what had been lost, as old friends, as two souls who had long ago stopped asking life to become something it no longer could. Leon watched the children playing nearby. "They don't know who we are." Vivian smiled. "They know. They just don't care." He laughed. "I like that. So do I." Silence settled between them. Comfortable. Peaceful. The kind of silence that no longer hid secrets. Only understanding. After a while, Leon spoke softly. "Do you ever regret leaving?" Vivian looked toward the great white building overlooking the sea. Hundreds of names had been carved into its walls. Not of kings or queens, but of soldiers, widows, teachers, doctors, volunteers, ordinary people who had changed extraordinary lives. She smiled. "I regret the pain. I don't regret the path." He nodded slowly. "I've finally reached the same place. I regret the choice, but not the man it forced me to become." She reached over and gently squeezed his hand. Then we both found peace. As the afternoon sun settled across the gardens, a group of children gathered around them. One little girl pointed toward the inscription carved above the entrance to the House of the Fallen. "What does it mean?" Vivian looked up at the familiar words. "Grief may explain a mistake, but only integrity decides what we do after it." She smiled warmly. "It means everyone makes mistakes. But every morning, we get to choose what kind of person those mistakes help us become." The little girl nodded thoughtfully before running back to her friends. Leon watched her disappear into the laughter. "That," he whispered, "is a better legacy than any throne." Vivian looked toward the endless sea. Perhaps once she had believed happiness meant remaining queen forever. Life had taught her something wiser. A crown could be taken away. A marriage could end. A heart could break. But integrity, once chosen again and again, could build a legacy no betrayal would ever erase. When history finally closed the final chapter of their lives, it remembered neither the affair nor the scandal as their defining story. It remembered a queen who walked away without seeking revenge. A king who spent the rest of his life honoring the promises he had once broken. And a fallen general whose sacrifice inspired a kingdom to care for every family left behind by war. Because in the end, the deepest form of poetic justice was never watching those who hurt you suffer. It was building a life so full of purpose that the worst day of your life became only the beginning of someone else's hope.